everyone, welcome to Morning Laziness. This is Nilima Kayes, and today we are bringing to you an interview session with Ms. Nisha Anand. Morning Laziness is an online magazine dedicated to women. It showcases various articles, personal life stories, and interview sessions on different matters concerning women. And today our interviewee, Ms. Nisha, happens to be the CEO of Dreamcore. So let us welcome our interviewee. Hello, Nisha.
Hello, thank you for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. It's early morning here, so it's 7 a.m., but I'm doing all right.
It's a pleasure to have you here with us on board at Morning Laziness today. So, how does an ideal workday look like for you to be beginning?
Well, I have two teenagers and a giant dog. I have a Great Dane. He's 165 pounds. He's like this kind of giant beast. And so every morning is usually he wakes up first and wants breakfast. And the teenagers then wake up and have a variety of needs, fix their hair, help them make lunches. So before I even start my workday, I feel like I've already had a whole workday. And for the last 2 years, most of my work days are at home due to COVID. I've been going into the office once or twice a week since things have relaxed a little bit, but working from home a lot. And the work I do, a lot of it is computer work these days. You organize people online, you talk to people online, you write, make connections, build community. A lot of it is in front of a computer. So I've realized a lot of my day is sitting down. So trying to figure out how to move is another part of my day.
Right. And many viewers right now can completely relate to this pandemic-oriented work schedule that we have adopted for the past 2 years with the lockdowns going on and with the COVID around. So yeah, I can relate to it too. So what did you have on your breakfast platter today?
Well, I haven't eaten breakfast yet, to be quite honest, but every day it's pretty much a breakfast taco, which is a tortilla and then whatever we have around the house. My whole family is vegetarian, so it's usually, leftovers from the night before, beans, whatever's around. I put in a breakfast taco, and that's kind of my morning.
Interesting. Now, since your profession is related with working with NGOs, have you previously worked in NGOs that voice for racial justice?
Yeah, my entire career has been in NGOs. I started after grad school at an organization called the War Resisters League. It's an international organization that works on different issues around pacifism. From there, I went to the Ruckus Society, which trains people in direct action and nonviolent civil disobedience. And after that, I was at the Rape Crisis Center in the city. And all of those places were obviously, pretty radical organizations that had really progressive ideas and ideals. And I think they all were struggling a little bit in how to talk about racism for different reasons. At the Rape Crisis Center, it was the first rape crisis in the center that was led by all women of color. And they had a very strong race analysis, but even there's a lot of questions about how do you give services and that are truly equitable. And my first job out of grad school was in 1999, so it was a while ago. And I was always hired a little bit to show my analysis and explain my analysis around racism. I actually once traveled around the country. When I was working for the War Resisters League, we lived in a bus. There were about 8 of us that lived in a bus and went to different cities to give a variety of trainings. And my training was like anti-racism 101 for activists. So it's a long part of my history for sure. And I'm very encouraged to see that most NGOs these days are really prioritizing race and equity. And that wasn't always the case. It was always a struggle, a bit of I don't quite understand. And I feel like we've turned a little bit of a corner in the world where most NGOs understand equity is important, whether they know exactly how to talk about it and what to do to really show that they're putting racial justice at the center of what they do. It's a long learning curve, but I am quite encouraged that it's more of a conversation now than it was when I started out.
That sounds quite interesting. And your career journey, I think it sounds quite adventurous as well. Yeah, and I can somewhat relate, and I can somewhat relate to your journey as a professional because even I had started my career as working with an NGO. So we used to work about we study the IPCC reports released by the UN and make webinars about climate change, educating the youth about climate change. So I can somewhat relate to the working schedule of an NGO.
Yeah.
Right. Now, what exactly motivated you to choose this particular career path?
Well, my parents immigrated from India, and so I was born in America, first generation. My dad's an engineer. So I don't think that being an activist was ever on the radar for my parents. Certainly, it wasn't instilled in me that my ambition was to do good in the world. It was really, these are certain careers that are going to help advance you, advance our family, really help the world in a very different way. And so I think that from a young age, it was kind of engineering, doctor, marry well, were kind of the things that were taught to me to be my values. And I wanted to break from that. I had no interest in engineering. And from a young age, I remember telling my parents, like, no, I'm going to have a house husband. I'm not going to be, the housewife. And so I remember from a young age having these feelings that I didn't quite fit with what was taught to me. So I guess, and I look back on it now, I think I knew that if I was going to break the mold, if I wasn't going to be exactly the type of Indian daughter they wanted, I had to be pretty extreme the opposite way and highly successful. So I do know from a young age, it was, if you're going to be an activist and you're going to be fighting, a freedom fighter in whatever way that was, do it big, do it strong. So I know that was a big part of it. Was I committed. I guess that's what it was I committed hard. But I also think growing up as a first generation kid in America, I also had this superpower to be between cultures. I was quite literally the bridge between the old world and the new. And I had to adapt between the family I grew up with and the community I was a part of growing up. I grew up in Georgia in the South, which was very much at that time in the 80s, a very black and white town. And I was somewhere in the middle. And I had to kind of bridge that as well. And so fitting in meant understanding and translating between a lot of different places and also being excluded from a lot of different places. And so for me, I didn't want anyone else to feel excluded. I did have this desire to have everyone belong, everyone find a place, every voice matter, because that was very much my experience. And so that's what I built my career on, was that desire to make sure that my ideas, the things I were fighting for, were going to be the most inclusive ideas possible, bring in the most people possible, and make sure that everyone had a place at the table to create a future where everyone matters.
That sounds so inspirational and motivational. Well, now let's move on to some questions about your professional life. In fact, so what exactly is Dream Cups all about? Since you happen to be the CEO, could you tell us about the services Dream Cups provide?
Yes, I feel very lucky to be the CEO of Dreamcore. We are an NGO that works with, really, we want to provide that home for change makers. We want to be a place where if you want to make a difference, you belong. So it sounds a lot like my origin story. So we try to find the biggest problem sets possible and solve them. And we work on criminal justice reform, climate justice, equity, green jobs, and diversity in the tech sector, and promoting equity in the tech sector. And we're very future focused. So we're trying to find the ideas that are going to move us ahead to that future where everyone has dignity and everyone has freedom. And I think what differentiates us from a lot of other NGOs is we do have a pretty progressive set of ideas. We are trying to make big changes, but we want to do it in a way that includes everybody. So we work across racial lines, partisan lines. The division in our country has become so toxic. And to be able to show that you can actually solve a problem that brings people together and heals people, that's quite unique too. So for anybody out there that's looking for a third way of organizing, it's not divisive this way, it's not divisive this way, it's a way that just really at its heart is about love and trying to move the country forward. That's what Dreamcore does.
Right. Now, what are the key programs of Dream Cups?
So we have a justice program, green program, and tech program. And criminal justice reform is focused a lot on legislation, bipartisan legislation, and working with a large group of leaders who are formerly incarcerated to really listen to their voices and what types of reforms are possible and what types of changes are needed. So we have a really large community that we call the Empathy Network of formerly incarcerated leaders around the country. Green for All is our longest running program, which is working on climate justice and really thinking about what types of reform we can get past that actually help solve the root causes of the problem and really help heal the harm where it is. We know that communities, the frontline communities that bear the brunt of climate change, the ones that are hurt first and worst by climate change, are the ones that usually profit last and least from the future green economy. And trying to make that change so that any future green jobs, green tech, and green climate policies really do help the communities that are impacted the most. Green for All has been leading that charge. And our tech program is a pretty hands-on program that is working on changing the demographics of the tech sector. We believe that all the future solutions are going to come from the tech sector. So it should really look like the future we want to create. So we have some hands-on job training programs with big corporate partners, and we actually help get jobs in the tech sector for our community.
That sounds interesting. Now, what were the challenges you had faced while creating this large community?
We're not always very popular, even though we have quite big solution sets. I think that's the biggest challenge, is we are equally from the right and left in this country, which for us is Democrats and the Republicans. I think we aren't really good at pleasing either side. And it's not because we're coming up with a compromise and, we're selling out our values. I think it's right now, there's just an unwillingness to listen to people who think differently than you. Even if you have similar goals on one issue, there's a lot of don't work with them because they don't agree with you on these other issues. And yeah, certainly in Congress and in the legislature, you can see that. Like, Republicans don't want to work with Democrats, Democrats don't want to work with Republicans, even if you're trying to solve the same problem. But it goes even further than that. Even in our local communities, if folks have a different set of life goals and different values, there has become this unwillingness to work together. And we don't stand for that. We want to find a common ground and a common purpose wherever it is. I think COVID was this really great eye-opener for people, at least it was how interconnected we are, how dependent on each other we are, how any hurt can hurt the whole community. We were dependent on people we hadn't seen before, our farm workers, our grocery store workers. We were absolutely dependent on them for living, and they were kind of invisible in the economy before. That shift, that ability to see how interconnected we were, was really powerful. And that, I think, is the heart of what Dreamcore wants to do in the community, is really say, hey, yes, people are very different than each other, but we still all need each other. And let's listen to the stories of folks that are different. Let's hear it. And that hasn't been popular my time here at Dreamcore. So I think we do have to deal with a little bit of haters, as we say, on either side sometimes when we come out with ideas.
Right, and it's so true. Nowadays we have found it really hard to accept the unique differences we have, or different opinions we have. It is so hard for humanity to accept that we are different, and we have got different thoughts and different minds that voice different opinions.
Yes.
Right. Now, you had also delivered a TED Talk on the radical act of choosing common ground. In fact, you had touched upon how your contributions through Dream Cubs were in a way rooted to your personal life as well. So growing up, how did these notions shape your personality?
I think it's a great question. It's kind of, when you look back on it now, or when I look back on it now, I can see a lot of my growing up and how it shaped who I am today. One of the stories that I grew up with was the partition in India. My dad was a baby during the partition. He was born in 45 and to a Hindu family that was on the north side of the border. And during the partition, and for the audiences that don't know, when the British left India, they just drew an arbitrary line. I don't want to deal with the fighting anymore. This is going to be Pakistan. This is going to be India. That's it. And just left. And it led to the largest forced migration in human history. And it wasn't just a forced migration, people traveling across borders. There was large-scale violence, and it was a pretty horrific time. And so anyone of my generation, and for generations to come, they have stories in their family of what that was like wherever they were traveling from. And our family happened to be a family traveling down the border from Pakistan back into India. And they were, I kept hearing the story because it involved my dad, that they were in hiding at some point, and they were, hiding from the militias and military that was roaming around. And at one point, my dad started crying. And the story goes that he was crying so much that my grandfather had made the really hard decision that he was going to sacrifice my father to save the whole family. There were a lot of kids, and he knew if he kept crying, they would all be found out and they all might be killed. But my grandma shook him. And that's usually the story we hear is, oh my goodness, your grandma was shaking him, and he stopped crying at just the right moment. And they did not sacrifice him, and our family lived. Obviously, that's a huge, huge story to grow up with, and hearing the weight that your father almost died in this really, traumatic situation. But there was this other part of the story that I didn't connect until much later, was that obvious things they knew before that recognized that what divided them, the partition and this actual vision, was not as important as what united them, which was their shared humanity. And so they hid my family, and they did it to great risk to themselves. And at one point, now I've heard the story that at one point, one of the militias made them swear on the Quran that they weren't hiding any Hindus. And that family did that for my family, which is quite scary to think about the risk that they took. Obviously, my family made it out fine. My dad is alive. I'm here today because of that. And I just think that in those situations, when you can take a risk that great, because you know that what unites us is stronger than what divides us, that life and loving your neighbor and loving your community, no matter their differences, is more important than everything else around you and all the noise. Those are extreme circumstances. And in my family, they were able to do that. I feel like it's part of my legacy to show people you can do that now. The consequences aren't life and death. It's purely just getting yelled at on Twitter by people that think differently than you when you make a stand. Surely I can do that. The great risks other people took before me, the great risks all of our ancestors and people who fought for freedom have taken, and all of our cultures, we can do the little work it takes to get a little bit of hate on Twitter for saying something that might be unpopular. And we can show that love that's sometimes seen as weak, or some people say, oh, you're all about love, and that's kind of silly. It's actually one of the hardest things to do. And so I think it's our duty to do that. I know that's a big piece of what I carry on in my work today.
Right, and thank you so much for sharing that personal life story. It is so touching, and since I have not been there during that particular phase, but hearing stories through Knowles and through your ancestors, you have a notion in your head about the partition and the chaos it did to people over there, and to their mindset, their unity about religions and everything. So I do have a small notion about it. And when I heard your story, I was like, you had been a victim. You had witnessed the same, and your father, in fact, got saved. So thank you so much for sharing that personal life story with us on board. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to us. Right. And how do you think as we individuals could develop a future free of racism or any other form of discrimination, perhaps? What are some of your suggestions?
Well, that is a giant question. That's a huge question. I don't know that any one person has the answer, but I do think it starts with the individual. Absolutely. We are all raised we grow up learning prejudice. Everyone says this, you're not born with it. We grow up learning it. And it is impossible to think that you're free from some of those notions in your own head. So I think first you have to really start at home and think, where do my prejudices lies and why? I think through understanding ourselves, there's a lot that you can understand in other people. But the problem with racism and how it's always played out is not with the individual. I think individual gives you understanding. I think the problem is when it's tied to power and when it becomes systemic and when people in power can use it to divide. Those are the things that have led to wars and genocide and invasion. And, when we're talking about the forced migration that we were just talking about during the partition, that this type of racism has always led to ills, but not in the individual. It's when it's weaponized at the systemic level. And that means really having a sophisticated idea of the world and learning more. It's very nuanced. It's not cut and dry. There are all sorts of things that created us into being exactly who we are now as humanity. And so I'd say avoid simple answers would be my first advice. Avoid simple answers. It's quite complicated how we got to where we are. So try to learn that. There are a lot of pieces of the puzzle that you don't always know. And take a very broad systemic approach to what you're trying to solve. It never, ever works to just shame somebody. That has never worked, to be like, oh, you're racist, or, this school is racist. It does not make them want to change. That is not a good strategy. It doesn't ever win. Understanding and listening really wins. What made that so? That's the only way to start figuring out how to unmake it so. So yeah, I would say the first thing is to be nuanced and be curious. And then the second thing would be to take a really systemic view. Racism works because it's part of the big system, and those aren't easy to fix, and they take time.
Right. Now, lastly, what do you think this world needs the most?
Love. I feel like I feel like that's an easy answer. For me, we've lost connection to what it means to love, and not love in just like the sweet way, like you might love a puppy, because they're cute. I love puppies. They're really adorable. Not that kind of love, but that deep love when it's hard, when everything is telling you not to love, when you're going to be ridiculed or shamed from your neighbors from it, when it breaks your heart a little bit. When you have that deep empathy for someone else, when you really connect with them on the heart space, you can't do harm. Once you love somebody, it is impossible to do harm to them. You'll protect them. You'll be fierce. You'll be the person that will fight to make sure everybody has a place. And so when I think about the future I want to create, where everyone has freedom and everyone has dignity, I do not think that's possible without the ability to love across difference. You have to be able to love something you don't know, something you don't understand, and have that curiosity about it.
Absolutely. So on that note, we come to the end of this interview session. We had a great time being with you, talking to you about these topics. Thank you so much for joining us today. We truly appreciate your time and patience. And thank you, audience, for listening to us today. Thank you so much, and hope you had a great time with us today.
Thank you for having me.